Hi, it's Penny here, and today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in June. So I read 11 books, and as usual we're going to go through this book battle style, which means that I pair up all the books, I battle them against each other, and we come up with the champion of the month. So I will leave timestamps down below if you want to jump to a particular section. Our first battle is fantasy, and then we've got some more fantasy, but specifically urban fantasy. Then we've got a couple of contemporaries and then some graphic novels, although one of the contemporaries is a group of 4 contemporary graphic novels. So let's get into talking about the books. And for our first battle, we're going to have Holy Sister by Mark Lawrence up against Fires of Vengeance by Evan Winter. So firstly, Holy Sister is the 3rd book of the Book of the Ancestors trilogy, the first book being Red Sister, the second one's Grey Sister, and then finally we've got Holy Sister. This book series primarily follows Nonna, who is this young girl with very violent tendencies who ends up going to this assassin school, or it's more of a convent where everyone is learning assassin abilities, but also these magical abilities. So in this world there are 4 different bloodlines, and if you have one of those bloodlines in your ancestry, then you will have different magical abilities. I found the magic in this world to be really interesting, and the politics and the bigger conflict was also very interesting with kind of a science fiction twist to it. But unfortunately, a lot of this book was set in the school and just these girls coming up with convoluted plans in order to help with the conflict at hand, but not really helping. And I personally find that part of the story kind of boring. I found that in the first book and the second book as well. And unfortunately, I think the second book was actually the best one in terms of having a lot more of the magic in the world and the politics. And this 3rd book was a little bit more back to the school. Also, this book was kind of told in 2 timelines, but I felt like because one of the timelines was set in the future of the other one, and that future kind of gave away a lot of the stuff that you were meant to be wondering about in the past. There was kind of one big thing that I think they left open to make you wonder, but I wasn't really that worried about that, so it didn't really keep me engaged. But still, I did like the action at the end, and I thought it came together in a very satisfying way. I think if you're a big fan of this series, then you would really like the conclusion, especially because it takes some time to kind of wrap up all the loose threads. Then moving on to Fires of Vengeance. This is the 2nd book, and I think the series is called The Burning. It's the sequel to Rage of Dragons. This is another one where the magic system in the world is really interesting, but I feel like the story isn't focusing on the parts that I'm the most interested in. So in the first book, we've got this boy named Tao, and he basically has this revenge plot that he's carrying out because of something that happened to his father. A lot of the fighting was just part of training, and in the first half of Fires of Vengeance that was also true, and I just find training battles to be the most boring. I don't tend to like war focused stories in general, and Fires of Vengeance was very war focused, so that was a bit disappointing for me. There was a little bit more about the demons. So in this world there's like this demon underworld that people can go to and draw magic from that world and use it in different ways. Primarily it's the women that use the magic, but Tao has managed to harness it for certain kinds of fighting as well. There are dragons, but still we got very little of the dragons in the 2nd book. So I'm still really waiting and hoping that we will get more dragons in the next book, but I'm not really sure that we will, because I don't feel like that's something that the author is focusing on, although there are a few hints that there is a bigger bit of story there, so fingers crossed we'll get more of it. I was very happy that in the 2nd book we got more of the Queen and her story, although there was a romance involved with her and I didn't really buy it. I wasn't really interested. I didn't really care. But I don't care about romance, so what do you expect? I think if you liked the first book, and especially like the vengeance and the training, then you'll like the 2nd book. But if it's the magic and the dragons that you're really hanging out for more of, then you might want to wait and see whether we get more of that in the 3rd book. So if I'm putting these 2 books up against each other, both of them were kind of a little bit disappointing in that there were really amazing elements, but they didn't focus on those elements as much as I would have liked. However, I do think that in Holy Sister I got more of what I wanted than I did in Fires of Vengeance, so I'm going to put Holy Sister through to the next round. Then for our next battle, we've got Summer Night by Jim Butcher up against Libriomancer by Jim C. Hines. Both these authors are called Jim. Terrible. Okay, so Summer Night is the 4th book, I think. I've lost count. I think it's the fourth book of the Harry Dresden Files. So this is a series all about this wizard named Harry Dresden, and he is like a paranormal investigator. He helps out the police, and he just basically tries to make the world a safer place. Unfortunately, he is constantly taking note of women in a very sexually objectifying way, and even when he's in life and death situations, which really frustrates me. I do think this fourth book was slightly better than that, but again, that may have been because I went into this one determined to ignore it, which seems to be the best way to approach it. As well, this one, it kind of has this fae element, which I thought was quite interesting. And I want to say that like the final battle, the final conflict that this builds up to was quite interesting, but I'm gonna be honest with you. It's only been a few weeks since I've read it, but I feel like I've forgotten a lot of the details. So even though I think this is possibly my most favorite Harry Dresden book, it still hasn't really stuck with me. Still, I have heard a lot of people say that the fifth book is one where we start to get more of the longer running plot thread, which I am interested to get into. So I will at least read a couple more books in this series before I decide whether I'm going to bail or not. It's a 17 book series, so we'll see how we go. And the other urban fantasy I read is Libriomancer. So this is the first book, and I think this series is called Magic Ex Libri. Basically, in this world, there is this book magic. So some people are able to pull things out of books or draw the magic out of books. Our main character, however, did fail his field training, and so he's been relegated to being a cataloger. And he works at this library just reading books and finding magic that the other Libriomancers will be able to use. There's also a lot of magical creatures that have made their way out of books, and so all the different kinds of magical creatures are based on books, although when I got to the end I discovered a list of all the books that are referenced in this book, and some of the books are made up. So I guess it's not completely from other books. In the beginning, this book kind of made out like it was a bit of a vampire war, and because the Harry Dresden books have a bit of a vampire war going on as well, and I was reading both these books at the same time, I was a little bit over vampire wars. However, then it does move into doing something much more interesting with this book library magic. And so I really liked that. I do wish that I had read Feed by Mara Grant before I read this, because that book does kind of play a bigger part than some of the other books, or just that there's characters from Feed that are referenced that you don't really need to know who they are to follow the story, but I would have liked to have known, especially since I do plan on reading Feed at some point. But it's not spoilers for Feed, but I think I would have gotten much more excited about that reference if I had already read Feed. So when I pick up the second book in that series, which I think I'm going to do because I do like this book magic, I'm going to look for that list first and maybe read any of the books that I've got on my TBR before I read that book. There is a romance in this book which is actually with a fictional character who has elements of her personality defined by the book she was written in, or elements of the way she approaches romances defined. And it was very interesting, but I'm not sure whether I really liked it. I'm still thinking about that. So if I'm going to put these two books up against each other, both of them are a little bit strange in the way that they treated women, but I do think that even though the Fae story in the Harry Dresden book was more interesting than the previous Harry Dresden books, I still think the book magic was much more creative than anything that's going on in the Harry Dresden books, and so for that reason I think I'll put Libriomancer through to the next round. Okay, so next we've got our contemporary round, which is The Liminal Space by Jackie McCrae, up against Giant Days volume 11 to 14. So The Liminal Space is a book by a New Zealand Maori author. I was hoping because of the beautiful cover that maybe it would have some magical realism in it. It didn't, but it was still a really beautiful, emotional book, and the cover is super beautiful as well, like even more beautiful than real life than the picture will make it seem. So we're primarily following these 4 people that live in this small town. One of them is this older man who a lot of the people in this village don't really like. They tell a lot of stories about him, but he owns a lot of books and a lot of people treat his place like a library, and he tries to find the right book for them that's going to help them with their problems. And he ends up building relationships with the other 3 characters who are all really struggling with life, and there's definitely an overarching theme of living the life that you want to live and not getting too stuck up on what other people think about you. So one of the characters is severely depressed, another one is dealing with an abusive husband, and the other one is I think kind of the most interesting because he's kind of an asshole because he's got this idea that he wants to be a successful person, and as a result he's kind of taking advantage of a lot of people. But all 4 characters go through some really difficult moments and it is very emotional. I do feel like it's the perfect book just to sit down and read in one sitting, because I do think that's the way that the emotions will hit you the hardest. I took a little break near the end and I kind of regret it because in some ways as well, like the ending is a little bit rushed. Like I remember when I was 50 pages from the end, I was thinking, how is this possibly going to be resolved in 50 pages? And the way that it was done is that it gives you an indication of the direction that the characters are going to go in, but it doesn't really give you like their full story, which I think is fine. But I think if you want the emotions to hit you the hardest, you've just got to read right through it. Then we have the last 4 volumes of Giant Days. So this is a graphic novel series that I've been reading since the start of the year, or I think I read the first one last year, but I've read all the rest of the series this year. And I just really love it. It follows these 4 girls and a few other characters through the university experience as they, you know, decide what classes they want to take, what they want to do with their lives, figure out how to make money and where they're going to live, and deal with relationship dramas and just all that typical university stuff that I'm kind of nostalgic for. I wouldn't really have expected to have enjoyed Giant Days as much as I have, but I just ended up really loving the characters, and spending time with them has just been such a calming experience. I think the last month or two I felt very stressed, and whenever I spent time reading these books it would just make me feel much happier. So I was very glad to have these books to read recently, and I absolutely enjoyed them. I thought the last book in the series did wrap things up very well. We got a little bit of their life past the end of university, which gave you this feeling that they were still going to be great friends going into the future, and it was just really fun and also kind of emotional and cathartic. So putting these 2 books up against each other, it's really hard because I feel very emotional about both these books. Although I'd probably say Giant Days was more fun, I don't think the Liminal Space would really be described as fun, since so many terrible things are happening to our characters most of the time. I thought the Liminal Space had some really great messages, but so did Giant Days, and just I ended up loving the characters of Giant Days so much that I just can't not put Giant Days through to the next round. So that's what we'll be doing. Then our last battle for this round is Dark One by Brandon Sanderson up against The Girl from the Other Side, Volume 10. So Dark One is Brandon Sanderson's new graphic novel series. I think it's going to be a series. I've seen it referenced as a standalone, but the ending didn't feel like things were wrapped up, so I'm pretty sure there's going to be more. Basically, we're following this boy who's always kind of had visions of another world, and eventually in the story he realizes that he is actually prophesized to become the Dark One in this world where they're living this constant narrative that goes in cycles. Now, he doesn't really want to be the Dark One, but it's kind of interesting to see how events push him towards being the Dark One, even though he's doing his best to be the good guy, or a good guy. Also seeing how some of the people on the good side are corrupted. I wouldn't say that it necessarily does anything particularly amazing in terms of switching that Chosen One trope on its head, but it was still an interesting read. One thing I will say is that it was a bit confusing at times, a little bit hard to follow. It was very dialogue heavy. I think Brandon Sanderson's basically trying to put like an epic fantasy into this graphic novel, and it was a bit much to take in. So even though I really enjoyed it, I'm not sure that the story fits the format. And as well, I will say that I didn't love the artwork. I found it a bit sketchy, and again, a lot of the panels didn't really add any value because they were just a space for the dialogue. I did think the colors were beautiful. There were some pages that had some really beautiful colors, but the actual art is not my style of art that I like for graphic novels. So it was okay. I enjoyed my reading experience. I will continue the series, assuming it's a series, but I do think it wasn't quite everything I had hoped it would be. Definitely improvement on Brandon Sanderson's White Sands graphic novel though, so that's good. He's making progress. Then we have The Girl from the Other Side at Volume 10. This is the second to last volume in this series, which is all about this really cute little girl who's being looked after by a teacher who is this dark demon-y creature. This particular volume was really focused on more of the demon-y side of things, and I think there was a volume earlier that focused on that, and I also found that one very confusing. I like kind of the aesthetic. It's kind of this very dark, creepy thing, but also kind of cute. So this one particularly, I was very confused. I think I understand what was happening, but at the same time, I'm not particularly happy with the direction it's going in. I'll be very interested to see how that final volume wraps things up. I'm not sure that it's going to be what I would like to happen, but I just really want the characters to be happy. That's all I want. So if I'm putting these two books up against each other, it's kind of hard because both of them were a little bit confusing. And I do think with the Girl from the Other Side volumes, you need to read them a few at a time to really get the right impact. And this one, I only read one volume. And I think just because there's not much in that volume, if I'm putting it up against Dark One, which is a bit longer, there was a lot more to find interesting and to like in Dark One. And so I'm going to put Dark One through to the next round. Okay, so now we are up to the semi-finals. And for our first battle, we've got Holy Sister by Mark Lawrence up against Libriomancer by Jim C. Hines. So putting these two books up against each other, both of them had really unique and interesting magic systems. I think I like the characters slightly better in Holy Sister, although it's not really fair because that's the third book in a series and Libriomancer is the first book. So I've had a lot more time to become attached to the characters in the Book of the Ancestors series. But I do think the characters were just a lot more fleshed out and more interesting. What was happening more interesting in the political world was more interesting. And I think the pacing of Holy Sister was better, even though I kind of would have said the pacing in Holy Sister wasn't great. So that's not great for Libriomancer, even though I would have said the pacing in Libriomancer was okay. So that's interesting. I don't think my brain is quite making sense. But I guess even though both had some quite unique elements, I think Holy Sister was more unique and the plot was more interesting. And it was definitely a very satisfying ending to the series. So for that reason, I'm going to put Holy Sister through to the next round. Okay, so our other battle in the semi-finals is going to be Giant Days volumes 11 to 14 up against Dark One by Brandon Sanderson. I feel like this should be obvious, but I actually like the art in Giant Days a lot better, even though it's a lot more simple. And maybe the colors aren't always as good as Dark One's colors. But some of the art in Giant Days is just a lot of fun, and I think it really represents the characters of Giant Days. And as well, I was just so attached to the characters in Giant Days, so I don't know how I couldn't do anything different than putting Giant Days through to the next round. And so then we're up to the final round, the finals of this book battle, and we're going to have Holy Sister by Mark Lawrence up against Giant Days volumes 11 to 14. This is interesting because normally I'm a big fantasy fan, and so you would think that I would put the fantasy through. I don't read much contemporary. I never expected to like Giant Days, but I really did. I just love the characters of Giant Days so much. I would definitely reread that again. Whether I would read the Book of the Ancestors again, I don't know. Maybe. It definitely had some interesting elements, but then again, I don't think I have time to reread that series because there's way too many other books that I want to read. However, I might read Giant Days again just because it would be fun, and if I felt like I needed something relaxing to read and something comforting to read, then Giant Days might be the option for me. And also they're graphic novels, so they're pretty quick to read as well. And honestly, I just think that it wouldn't be honest of me not to put Giant Days through to the next round just because I love the characters so much and I just had so much fun reading that series. So Giant Days is going to be the champion of the month. I can't possibly pick my favorite volume because I read them all, kind of binging the whole series, and so the whole story has kind of blended together in my head. But if it sounds at all interesting to you, I would really recommend you pick it up. So do let me know if you have read any of the books that I talked about in this video, or if you're interested in reading them now. So I would love to talk with you about them down in the comments. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.